I see people coming into today's webinar on women and the rights of citizenship. My name is Patrick Campbell, and I'm at James Madison's Montpelier here in Orange, Virginia. And as we are getting started, we would love it if you would put where you're tuning in from for this webinar. Hopefully you can see myself and Dr. Katie Crawford-Lackey at the director, who is the director for the Center for the Constitution. I see we've got participants rolling in. We'll get started maybe in about 2 minutes. Exciting discussion today about citizenship and women in citizenship, which so many of us, including myself, think of, well, citizenship, that's voting. Maybe that's when they can haul you into court. And I think Katie's going to be able to help us with, well, there's a lot of aspects to citizenship. And by looking at women's citizenship, we learn about everyone's citizenship. So maybe about another minute as folks are coming in. Need somebody to break the ice and put in the chat where they are zooming in from. You get a shout out if you're the farthest away and a shout out if you're the closest. And when you come see me on site, I'll give you a free Constitution if you're closest or farthest. So pop in the chat. We've got maybe another minute or so, and we'll do an introduction and get going. So we've got Fredericksburg. You might not win because we've also got Covington here. That might be a little bit closer. We'll have to figure it out when folks get on site. Where else are folks coming in from? Got about 30 seconds. Manchester, Massachusetts. You may get the free Constitution for zooming in from the farthest. We'll see if anybody comes in from the West Coast. We've got friends from Charlottesville. We've got people making up islands they wish they were on, but it's a member, so I don't think he's really coming in from Mauritius. I will give him a free Constitution. We're going to get started in about 30 seconds here, folks. I've asked people to put in the chat where they're coming in from, and that would be great. So today we're going to do a webinar on women and the rights of citizenship, and that is thanks to a generous grant from the Virginia Law Foundation. And I am at the Center for the Constitution at James Madison's Montpelier. My name is Patrick Campbell. The Center for the Constitution is on the grounds of Montpelier, which was the lifelong home of a young revolutionary who really sketched out what would become and still is the framework for our U.S. democracy. James Madison is pivotal in propelling us forward in both establishing and expanding our democracy by shaping the framework for the U.S. Constitution. Yet it's no surprise to you when I say in Madison's time, the concept of being a citizen was very much controlled by one's skin color and by one's gender. So I'm really excited to talk with the director of the Center for the Constitution today, who's got some thoughts to share with us about citizenship, and specifically through the lens of how women in America have shaped our understanding of our rights and therefore our understanding of our Constitution. So Dr. Katie Crawford-Lackey is a public historian, and she specializes in place-based history. She joined the team here at Montpelier 2 years ago, bringing her expertise in civic engagement and historic site interpretation. Prior to coming to Montpelier, Katie's service has included multiple positions at the National Park Service, with AmeriCorps, with Disabled American Veterans, and archaeology fieldwork. So Katie, if you could say hello and just maybe give us a overview of what we're going to discuss today.
Yeah, thank you, Patrick. That was a really flattering introduction. I'm really excited to be talking with you all today about citizenship and what that looked like for women in America over time. We often think about citizenship in connection with suffrage, and obviously the two are very closely linked, but there are some differences. And as we kind of have this conversation today, we'll talk about some of the messiness of the process. So often citizenship looked different at different points in American history. It applied to different people at different points, and it didn't always include suffrage. So this is, I think, a really necessary conversation as we think about today and how we participate in our political processes and what our civic responsibilities are. So thank you, Patrick. I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Wonderful. I love that word messiness. That our democracy, this first federal system in the world, when we talk about citizenship in the United States, it's going to be shaped by what's now the 50 states and the districts. So these different applications you brought about, Katie. So to help us with the messiness, some definitions as we think about citizenship today. How might it be defined in the past? And then how might it be defined differently today?
So the idea of citizenship, at least kind of the core, how we think about it today, originated in ancient Greece. And we see the Greek philosopher Aristotle talking a lot about this in his writings. So he believed that a citizen is one whom is basically participating. He's active in the deliberative and judicial processes of the community in which he lives. And he saw this active participation as essential to citizenship. And his thinking and his writings really provide a core foundation for how this concept develops over time. And specifically, he's looking at what that means in terms of who is a participant and who isn't, and citizenship being connected to that active involvement. Now, for today, the idea of citizenship has changed over time. It's not defined the same way, but today we understand it to mean a member of a political body in some form. It denotes a kind of relationship between an individual and the state. So the state recognizes that there are certain individual rights, and then the individual adhering to a set of rules or laws that the state puts in place. And for today in the United States, you're either born a US citizen or you are a naturalized citizen. And how we have defined that, at least in the United States over time, has not always been clearly defined. In fact, the men who wrote the founding documents also did not clearly define what citizenship looked like. So there's been a lot of questioning. There's been a lot of laws and policies passed in American history trying to figure out and define this question of who is a citizen, who should be included in that group, and what rights and responsibilities do they have?
So citizens, a member of a political body, they need to adhere to rules and laws, and yet two of our central founding documents, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, are really, can I say sketchy, Katie? That they really don't tell us what the citizen is or that relationship.
I think that's a fair point. The Declaration of Independence, for example, even at that time, some women were actually noting that they disagreed with some of the language in it. And I like to point to Abigail Adams, who was writing to her husband, John Adams, in 1776, several months before it was actually written. But, there's a lot of rhetoric at that time about what does independence look like, who's included in that. And she writes to her husband if particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. And I think the Declaration of Independence is one to keep in the back of your mind, because it really becomes a focal point when we start talking about the start of the women's rights movement in the United States in the mid-19th century. But in terms of what does the Constitution say, it does imply that citizenship exists, but it doesn't explicitly define it. So, for example, Article 1, Section 2 talks about the House and the Senate, and it talks about how long somebody needs to be a resident in order to qualify to serve in those positions. Article 1, Section 8 talks about Congress's ability to establish a uniform rule of naturalization. Article 2 talks about who may be president, and that person needing to be a natural-born citizen. Article 3 talks about the judiciary and its ability to kind of oversee jurisdiction of controversies between citizens in different states. So it's being referenced throughout. Obviously, the founders had an idea about it, but they're not articulating it in this document.
And okay, so Declaration of Independence doesn't articulate it. Constitution, our original 7 articles don't. We get to the Bill of Rights, introduced by James Madison, 1789. And I still think in the Bill of Rights, we don't have a definition or what laws a citizen adhering to rules and laws. We still don't say who that citizen is.
Yes, that's true. And that's a point where there's some, I would say, conversation about what that should look like, particularly the responsibilities that are entailed in citizenship. For example, voting and suffrage being a key part of that. So when you think about the rights of citizenship, suffrage or the right to vote is a key one that comes to mind. Voting is seen as a tool of citizenship. If you're actively participating in what you want to see happen in your community, that should be, again, according to Aristotle, part of what's entailed in citizenship rights. But it's interesting because in America, particularly in the early years, there's not a direct correlation between the two. So being a citizen did not always denote suffrage rights. Neither was voting predicated on citizenship. So non-citizens actually voted in local, state, and national elections in almost every state from the founding of the United States up until the 1920s. So particularly at that point in time when these men are thinking about how do we create a government, after the American Revolution, there's this idea that voting is not necessarily tied to residency status. Instead, it's correlated with race, gender, and property owning. So non-citizens could vote, but voting often excluded people who didn't own property, women and people of color. So this typically favored those who were wealthy, landowning white men at the time. Now, this starts to change around the time of the War of 1812. So there wasn't a lot of concern or fear about who was voting before that, because again, it was primarily white landowning men. But with the war, there's a growing concern of immigrants and the influence that they could have on American politics. And a lot of immigrants also did not appreciate the system of slavery in the United States. So a lot of Southern states were concerned about that. Now, you mentioned the Bill of Rights, which was passed in 1791. So this this period of time, right after the Constitution is ratified, we have Madison drafting the Bill of Rights. We do start to see some parameters around what citizenship and participation looks like. And we see that with the passage of the 1790 Naturalization Act. And this act applies to free white men and women, and says that those who have resided within the jurisdiction of the United States for a period of 2 years are eligible for citizenship. And so this applied to folks. They could go to their local court, apply for citizenship. It would apply to their children that were under 21. Now, the act doesn't necessarily exclude women, but citizenship is ambiguous for women at that time.
So you said the Naturalization Act of 1790 free white men and women. So we've got a whole lot of Americans, including 1790. I'm going to be in the ballpark, 2 million, maybe 1 million, I should say, enslaved Americans who are not considered citizens under the law, the Naturalization Act established by the Constitution. Is this where we're getting into the lead up to the Civil War and we start to see pressing on what does it mean to be citizen again?
Yeah, so around the mid 19th century, there are a lot of questions being raised about who should be a citizen, who should have suffrage rights. So in 1855, for example, we do have around this time, because there's a big influx of immigrants in like 1830s up to the 1850s, leading up to the Civil War. 1855, the federal government clearly establishes that an immigrant woman who marries an American man can become a citizen. So we actually see that process being defined, how that happens. Now, an American woman who marries an immigrant man at that time isn't necessarily stripped of her citizenship, but it's important to remember that the husband has a lot of authority and power over the rights of his wife. And we see this kind of dance with citizenship and women and who is a citizen, who is not, up until actually 1907, until the Expatriation Act, which Congress passes, which actually strips American women who marry immigrant men of their citizenship. That's repealed in 1922, but there's a period of time in American history where women are being stripped of their citizenship rights. And to your point, this looks different for different groups of people. So it looks different for women, citizenship and their rights. It looks different for African Americans at that time, free and enslaved. It looks different for different groups of immigrants as well. So these are important things to be thinking about as we kind of grapple with, you know, what does this mean as we start to define who's an American? Because again, you know, you could have women, white women, being citizens at that time, 1850s, 60s, but they can't vote. So there's a kind of disconnect between the votes that are endowed with the rights of citizenship.
And folks, if you want to put a question in the chat, we will try to address it. My question is, Katie, the Civil War, huge changes in America, but pre-Civil War, this new democracy, I think, should be arguably in some ways quite happy with itself. Wow, you've established a new democracy, you've broken away from the British Empire. You've defended yourself in the War of 1812. It looks like it's actually going to work. This miracle at Philadelphia, this experiment. But we're talking about basic things like who's a citizen and who can be enslaved or free. And so the Civil War period, both before, during, and after, seems crucial to this question of how America is going to define citizens. Can you talk either about the abolitionist movement interplaying with the suffrage movement and some of the milestones there?
Yes, I think that's a great point, because we see a correlation between social movements that are emerging in America at that time. So we see the first collective effort to organize for women's rights in 1848 with the Seneca Falls Convention. So a group of women organize and men and gather in Seneca Falls, New York, to talk about the rights they think they are endowed with. And so these women essentially draft what's called the Declaration of Sentiments, and that is echoing the Declaration of Independence. It's an intentional commentary. It's tying these ideas about what women think their rights are, tying them to the founding era ideas about claims to freedom and liberty. And they're framing this as, so they basically write out this declaration. It reads like the Declaration of Independence with the word women added into it. So it's not just men who are endowed with these rights. And they frame it as, it's not that they don't have the right to vote or the right to, retain their property from their husband. The federal government is actively denying them that right. Which is a really interesting and progressive argument for the time. And to your point, so this kind of kicks off what we would consider the women's rights movement. And obviously suffrage is kind of the core of that, but there's a lot of other rights that they're fighting for as well. And this does have a very close correlation to the abolitionist movement, because a lot of the folks that were involved in that movement are also involved in the women's rights movement. And we see kind of this connection of allyship happening between these abolitionists, between these women's rights advocates. For example, William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. We have a lot of people who are involved in both movements. And it helps really push the effort forward. And again, these two movements are connected because there's this common sense of we need universal suffrage. We need voting rights for women and all women, and we need voting rights for African Americans and all African Americans. And a big blow to this collective effort was the Dred Scott decision in 1857. So you're kind of referencing the Civil War and what's going on contextually in the United States at the time. This case, Dred and Harriet Scott were enslaved in Missouri, and they're taken into free territory. And essentially they sue for their freedom, and the case goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And the ruling is just, I think, one of the biggest failings of the Supreme Court, because it essentially recognizes that African Americans should not be eligible for citizenship. So they don't have any of the rights and privileges that citizens of the United States have. And this applies to both free and enslaved African Americans. So we start to see the government defining what that looks like for African Americans. And again, the Civil War and what happens afterwards in the wake of that with Reconstruction changes the political landscape a bit. And I'm specifically referencing the 14th Amendment, which actually is the first time that we really see citizenship defined in the Constitution. And that is designed to protect African Americans, enslaved and free, and recognizing their citizenship. However, again, that does not mean that they have the right to vote in the eyes of the federal government, right? And that's where we see the 15th Amendment come in, which recognizes suffrage rights of African American men. Now, I will say the 15th Amendment doesn't guarantee the right to vote. If you read it, it prevents the discrimination based on race. So there's this loophole there, and that's going to be important because we'll come back to this later. when we talk about the civil rights movement and why that was so critical in this conversation. So the 15th Amendment, though, big win, right? The enfranchisement of Black men, but it does not include women, and it leads to this big schism with the women's suffrage movement.
And if I can try to frame this, and correct me if I'm wrong, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, post-Civil War amendments. I don't mean to minimize the incredible loss of life and health and from the Civil War, but in terms of this program, the political outcomes. And we had a question about suffrage. So 15th Amendment, the right to vote cannot be denied based on previous condition of servitude or race. And if we use the word suffrage or enfranchisement or voting, really no distinction for the purpose of this program. All mean the same thing. The suffrage, the ability to vote; enfranchisement, the franchise, the ability to vote. 13th Amendment, I want to get back to the 14th, Katie, because I know you've got some things to school me on. 13th, no more servitude, no more slavery in America. But as you say, the 14th is an amendment in our Constitution that in a large part is aimed at the states. And so we're getting into this US definition of citizenship, where many issues such as voting, marriage, other things may be controlled by the state, much of criminal law controlled by the state. So 14th Amendment, we get an equal protection clause, we get a privileges and immunities clause, we get just compensation. How does that 14th Amendment, which really is written in the aftermath of the Civil War and the end of slavery, how does that play into women's citizenship? And how do women use the 14th Amendment in their push for, or women and others in their push for women's citizenship, full citizenship?
Yes, the 14th and 15th Amendment both are important defining moments for the suffrage movement. And again, it looks how everything plays out in the aftermath looks different for different groups of people. So the 15th Amendment specifically, there were certain proponents within, again, there's like a collective movement between a lot of the folks who are abolitionists and want, full rights for African Americans, as well as people who are really pushing for women's suffrage. But some folks like Frederick Douglass, a white woman named Lucy Stone, they're very supportive when the 15th Amendment passes. Even though it doesn't include women, it's still a big win for American society, they feel. Now, some others did not feel that way. Specifically, Susan B. Anthony, for example, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And those two women were actually pretty close friends with Frederick Douglass. Again, they were united around this idea of universal suffrage. But when the 15th Amendment passes without any provision for women, we start to see a lot of this racist rhetoric coming from Anthony and Stanton. They think that amendment should have included rights for men and women. And they start to make these arguments about why white women were more qualified to vote than Black men. So we see those two women kind of break off and they establish their own branch of the women's suffrage movement, National Women's Suffrage Association. And we see other women who were, inspired by and supportive of the 15th Amendment, like Lucy Stone, start their own group, the American Women's Suffrage Association. So these groups that kind of split are working for common goals, but they're divided in how they think that should happen. And it's really important to note that Black women played an active role in this struggle for universal suffrage this whole time, but they're really marginalized both by Black men and by white women. So they are often kind of pushing for civil rights. They're pushing for universal suffrage. They're being pulled in these different directions. So we see, instead of a specific focus on just suffrage, for example, we see Black women, creating organizations to advance civil rights for all people. And some of these women included, Sojourner Truth. She's one of the early suffragists. We see Mary Ann Shadd Cary, for example, who's a lawyer from DC. We also see Nannie Helen Burroughs, who is a woman originally born in Orange, Virginia, where Montpelier is located. She is an important Black woman in this fight for suffrage and civil rights for African Americans. And so as these women are being kind of discriminated against and kept out of these, male-run or white woman-run organizations, they're creating their own organizations and pushing this forward in their own ways. And you mentioned the 14th Amendment, Patrick, and how kind of the tie-in with that and how that furthers women's suffrage. We start to see women use that as a justification for their right to vote. Because again, within the 14th Amendment, they are citizens of the United States, but they do not have suffrage rights. And there's one case in particular that I'll note because I think it's a good one, 1875 Minor versus Happersett. Virginia Minor is a suffragist. She is kind of head of the Missouri suffrage groups. She is pushing back on this idea that she doesn't have voting rights. She's a citizen. She thinks she should have voting rights. So she actually attempts to register and vote in Missouri. And she's told, no, like that's, you don't have this legal right. And she goes to court to challenge that. Now, the court does not rule in her favor. The court rules that citizenship does not confer the right to vote. So it's a very interesting case in that we see the federal government saying citizenship does not mean you have suffrage rights. Again, hearkening back to Aristotle and some of these ideas of the founding fathers, the idea that you can't participate and shape the society you live in, that's a key part of citizenship. So again, we're kind of defining how this evolves over time in America.
And again, folks, if you have a question, you can put it in the chat. We'll get to as many as we can. So I think we're leading up to the passage of the 19th Amendment, 1920. It sounds to me, it's almost 150 years after this birth of democracy in America, if I use 1776 date. And we're spending all that time, almost 150 years, to figure out that all women have the right to vote. But that plays into the federalism, maybe the messiness, the good messiness of federalism. So maybe talk a little bit about the efforts on a state level. You mentioned Missouri, as well as a national level, and do those complement or contradict each other?
Yes, and the answer to your question, again, speaks to this messiness. So some women were actually voting, maybe not at the federal level, but, school board elections, local elections before the 19th Amendment. And we see that happen more as Western states are added to the Union. So some Western states do in there, when they go from a territory to a state, they write in their state constitution, franchising women. So recognizing that women have the right to vote. So a lot of the suffrage movement up until that point, there was different strategies. One of the strategies was to try to implement women's suffrage at the state level, because even if you didn't get it broadly all at once, you could at least establish it state by state. We really see a strong push for suffrage at the federal level, so an amendment to the US Constitution in the early 1900s. This we had Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. Those are names that we grow up hearing in the classroom. They were some of the early suffragists. But now we see a new generation of women coming and kind of taking over and leading the way. One such woman was Alice Paul. And she comes onto the national stage really in 1913 when she organizes this parade, suffrage parade in Washington, D.C. And it's one of the first collective marches in the Capitol. So what happens is these several thousand, I think about 7,000 to 8,000 women, they gather in the Capitol and they march from the Capitol to the White House carrying banners. They've got floats and costumes on, and they're basically lobbying for suffrage rights. And this is, they have a national audience, and this kind of takes the effort for a national amendment to the next level. And we see, after a lot of protests, for example, the Silent Sentinels, these women who stood outside of the White House in Lafayette Square with banners protesting for suffrage rights during Woodrow Wilson's presidency in 1917. They're out there. They're some of the first to actually picket in front of the White House. So it's not just this kind of what these women are demanding of their government, it's how they're doing it. They're actually redefining the protest landscape in the United States and setting a precedent for future social movements. So we see a lot of energy around this, and eventually 1919, the 19th Amendment is drafted and is ratified, and it recognizes women's right to vote. But I should say, kind of a caveat to that, yes, we do see women now being able to participate, but it's still exclusionary. Again, we talked about how citizenship and suffrage looks different for different people. So for example, Native American women. Native Americans are not recognized as US citizens until 1924. So when the 19th Amendment is passed, Native American women are not able to vote. We also have, folks in the District of Columbia that don't have the right to vote. We also see the right to vote being extended to different people of different ages throughout the 20th century. So the 19th Amendment was obviously a huge win, but it did not include everybody. And I think that's kind of where we get into the conversation about the importance of the civil rights movement.
Right. I love that explanation of using those, what we think of as citizen freedoms, to advocate for citizenry, assembling, petitioning, speech, and the Silent Sentinels, the speech of that. Maybe I don't want to use the word patiently, but the persistence of saying you have to recognize it. And it still happens. Katie, I'm born during the civil rights movement. So this is a little bit more now in my lifetime, but we're getting into, now we're almost 200 years into this democracy, right? 1950s, 1960s, if I can use that to frame the civil rights movement. What are the further pushes? Who are some of these people leading this effort to really fully include women as citizens?
Yes. So especially for Black women, African Americans in general, but even after the passage of the 15th Amendment, enfranchising Black men, ratification of the 19th Amendment, recognizing women's suffrage rights, Black Americans are being kept from the polls essentially through a number of different mechanisms. So we have straight up intimidation. We have groups like the Ku Klux Klan threatening and perpetrating violence against Black people who go and vote. And this threat of violence and committing violence shouldn't be, it's really important to understand kind of the fear. But it's not just that, it's also literacy tests. It's also poll taxes. So there's very systematic ways that Black Americans are kept from the polls in the late 1800s throughout the first part of the 20th century. And so the idea, not just with the civil rights movement, but even before that, even in the 1910s, 20s, 30s, African Americans are asserting their civil rights. We particularly see this around wartime, when we have Black Americans serving in the military and returning home, and this idea that not only am I a citizen, but I've actually actively fought for and defended my country, and society should recognize the rights that I'm endowed with as a citizen. But you're right, it's the civil rights movement that we start to see tangible legislative gains towards this end. And yes, we had these, giants of the movement like Martin Luther King Jr., Reverend Abernathy, but it's actually women who are kind of the crux of the civil rights movement and suffrage and furthering voting rights and access to the vote. And one person that I think every American should know is Septima Clark. She's born in South Carolina, and she is an educator, she's an activist, and she is key in helping people access the vote. Again, because we have these barriers like literacy tests, and in creating ways and systems and schools. She created these citizenship schools that furthered literacy, that furthered education of citizenship, so that Black Americans could go to the polls and then pass these literacy tests and then access the vote. That was key. So yes, we do need big legislative gains, like some of the leaders of the movement were advocating for. But she's a really fascinating and important figure because she's out in the field actively ensuring that people are able to participate in the system through the creation of these citizenship schools. And again, there's a lot of protests that really spur the passage of legislation recognizing civil rights and suffrage rights, similar to the women's suffrage movement earlier in the century. And we see not only the Civil Rights Act, which was passed in 1964, we also see the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And that act prohibits racial discrimination in voting. And it specifically outlaws literacy tests and gives the government the authority to kind of take over and intervene when counties are being persistent in their discrimination based on race. So that was a really critical recognition and protection of Black Americans' rights and suffrage rights that were protected by the 15th and 19th Amendments.
Thanks. We're going to wrap this up soon. So if you have a question, please put it in the chat. Katie, I just love the way you framed this in terms of rights of a member of a political body. And throughout, you've been talking about responsibilities. And somebody like Septima Clark taking the responsibility in her community to make change and to change how all of us think about not just women as citizens, but Native Americans, African Americans, et cetera, and that we broaden this meaning of rights and responsibilities of member of a political body. Certainly, I can't imagine the argument it doesn't make us stronger, as this political body really encourages, requires, and expects more involvement. Are there steps that you see? Are there advocacy for changes still to come as we're in 2023 that we've somehow limited the rights or responsibilities of citizens in America?
Oh, yes, I think certainly. And the 14th Amendment is one of those that, again, defining citizenship, it's one of the most don't want to say contested, but it's the most challenged in a way, because we're always asking, what does citizenship look like? Who should be eligible for that? And, for those folks who are not born citizens, the process to become a naturalized citizen, you do have to prepare and study and take a test on the US Constitution, United States history, and it requires you to be an informed participant. And that's, I think, a really empowering thing that we should all kind of strive to better understand our democratic system and how we can participate in that. And not just for federal elections, but also what that means at our local level. And what does change look like in our community? What should our communities look like, and how do we get there? What tools do we have through our rights of citizenship to do that, particularly through the right to vote?
Right, that chance to be informed participants and the joys that Katie and I get of working at Montpelier, of just engaging with the public. It's a very reflective space and a chance for us to consider what this thing of the people, republic, that thing of the people, what this democracy, government by the people, what's it mean, and how can we be informed participants? And you've mentioned leaders at the local level and leaders at the national level. Katie, before I sign off, any final thoughts for us?
Well, thank you all for tuning in today. Really appreciate your time. I hope you learned a few things, and I'd say please stay tuned in to the center and all the great programming we're doing.
Thank you so much. We are open 5 days a week now, and our website, montpelier.org, has information about springtime events. We've got a lot of events geared just to springtime. Our different tour offerings, our trails, over 8 miles of trails, our award-winning exhibits. Montpelier is a memorial to James Madison and the enslaved community that lived here. It's a museum of American history. And it's also a center for constitutional education that really seeks to engage the public with the enduring legacy of Madison's most powerful idea, government by the people. So we hope you can visit us soon. Thank you so much for tuning in. Bye-bye, folks.